US Chapter 2, Growth and Reform. So the big overarching question is, how did Jacksonian democracy, the reforming spirit, and the idea of manifest destiny shape the United States? So if we look at this chapter overview, the big question is, was this age of Jackson an era of expanding democratic rights? And so we're going to be looking at a few of these key things: growth, all of those things listed: geographical, political, social, cultural; reform, changing some of these things and addressing some of the issues where maybe we're not quite where we want to be yet. So the first section is democracy, nationalism, sectionalism. The second section is the Great Awakening. 3 and 4 go together: expanding equality, anti-slavery, women's rights. And the last section is this idea of manifest destiny. So this first section, what you should be able to do by the end is explain how the rise of Jackson was linked to expanding democratic rights, the causes and effects of the Indian removal, and then Jackson's politics in regards to this concept of nullification in the national bank. So first of all, when we look at the rise of Jackson, the two elections that he takes part in, or at least the first two elections he takes part in, is 1824, 1828. And so what this graphic shows is the number of popular votes that they received and also the number of electoral votes that they received. And one of the big things that you should pay attention to is, if you look at the popular vote, it goes from 350,000 to 1.1 million. So what you're seeing is a whole bunch of new people are now eligible to vote in 1828 as opposed to 1824. And if you go back even further, since 1820 to 1828, this is a pretty dramatic increase. It goes from 1 in 3 white men to being eligible to vote to 8 out of 10 being able to vote. So when you look at this first election in 1824, President Jackson wins the most popular votes. But because he doesn't have a clear majority of the Electoral College, it goes on to the House of Representatives, and eventually Adams is able to win. John Quincy Adams wins. The problem is that this is going to really solidify Andrew Jackson. He views John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay as his enemies, and he is going to build up a very strong party organization over the course of the next 4 years. When he wins in 1828, he's going to institute the spoils system. This is the idea that you reward your political supporters with jobs in the U.S. government. And so that's going to be a major change in how things are done and run. When you look at the Indian removal, the causes of it is pretty simple. Whites want access to the lands held by the 5 civilized tribes, and not just the 5 civilized tribes, but Native Americans in this part of the country. And so when they pass this Indian Removal Act, the Native American groups, the Cherokee and the Creek, they sue, and their case goes all the way to Supreme Court. The Supreme Court rules in favor of the Native Americans, but Jackson doesn't care, and he pushes this Indian removal, forces them out to Oklahoma Territory, and this journey that takes place where lots of Native Americans lose their lives is known as the Trail of Tears. When we look at the nullification crisis, the idea of nullification is that states can ignore laws that they don't agree with. John C. Calhoun is the Vice President of the United States, and he champions this concept of nullification. He believes that these tariffs that Congress are passing are unconstitutional because they are picking winners and losers. They're helping support the northern states, and they're hurting the southern and middle states. And so when you look at this, South Carolina is going to nullify this tariff act. And they're essentially threatening to leave the United States over this. Even though President Jackson supports states' rights, the real issue here is that you don't want to give states the ability to nullify or ignore laws and rules that they don't like. That was one of the real problems with the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation, is that the federal government really didn't have the authority to control the things that it needed to control. The other thing is this threat of secession, this idea of leaving because you don't get your way, that's way too much for Andrew Jackson to support. So he's going to send the military down there if he has to. Here comes Henry Clay once again, who gets known as the Great Compromiser. We're going to hear his name come up over and over and over again, especially when we get to the compromises over the addition of new states. When we look at the economic woes, Jackson believes that this Bank of the United States is something that favors the wealthy people in this country. And he wants to support farmers and the common everyday man, because when you go back to that election, that's really how he gets elected, is by portraying himself as an everyday guy. And so he needs to stand up and fight for the common man. And he sees this bank fight the best way to do it. When we look at what has happened over the course of 1828 is that the Whig Party forms, and mostly the Whig Party is made up of Jackson's political enemies, or people who have ideas different than Jackson. They do want a strong federal government versus favoring more states' rights. And Jackson is able to veto this bank, and then he pulls all the money out of the bank and essentially causes it to dry up and killing the bank. When we look at politics post Jackson, one of the downfalls of getting rid of the Bank of the United States is that there's really no way to kind of control the economy of the country anymore. The bank had the ability to put money into circulation or pull money out of circulation. They could control interest rates to some extent. They could loan money out into places that needed money. So they really had a way of making sure that the economy wasn't too disruptive. Once the bank is gone, what's going to happen is every 6 to 8 years, we're going to have some kind of a major economic crisis or panic. And that's the way things are going to operate until 1913 and the Federal Reserve gets created. The other thing is politics post-Jackson, 1840 on, there really isn't a whole lot of ideas that are talked about. It's more about presenting yourself as being the candidate for the common everyday people. And so it's not really campaigns of ideas. It's who can be the most like Andrew Jackson. And those are the people who tend to get elected.